Ford F-150's engine whined, a strained protest against the steep, unpaved road. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as the tires kicked up a cloud of ochre dust. The road, little more than a pair of muddy ruts carved into the dense Appalachian hillside, was a testament to the isolation he was driving into. He'd followed the GPS until it gave up, its cheerful female voice replaced by a flat, defeated, signal lost. From then on, he relied on a hand-drawn map his lawyer had provided, a cryptic set of landmarks: a gnarled oak, a faded wooden cross, a creek that forked, that felt more like clues to a treasure hunt than directions to a home. For a history professor from Boston, the move was a complete upheaval. Ethan had spent his life in sterile archives, deciphering forgotten texts and cataloging the echoes of the past. The inheritance, a small two-room cabin, and a few acres of wooded land in a place called Blackwood Hollow, West Virginia, felt like a joke. The benefactor, a great-aunt named Ethan Vance, was a woman he didn't even know existed until her passing. The lawyer's letter had been vague, mentioning only that Ethan had left her property to her last living kin with a taste for the old ways. Ethan, a specialist in regional American folklore, had certainly fit the bill. The air grew heavy and damp, thick with the scent of pine and decay. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers, filtering the late afternoon light into a mosaic of shifting shadows. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a primal, ancient dread that clung to the air like the humidity. He told himself it was just the isolation, the sheer silence broken only by the crunch of gravel and the distant cry of a hawk. Finally, the trees parted to reveal a clearing. A small, weathered log cabin sat nestled against the mountain, its porch sagging and its windows like vacant eyes. An old well pump stood in the yard, its rusted handle a monument to a bygone era. A rusted, skeletal swing set stood sentinel to the side, creaking softly in a non-existent breeze. The sight was both picturesque and profoundly unsettling. This was it, his inheritance. As he killed the engine, the silence rushed in, a deafening absence of sound. It was the kind of quiet that held secrets, the kind that made you listen for the things you weren't supposed to hear. He got out of the truck, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and walked to the porch. The front door was unlocked, a sign of a community where locks were either unnecessary or completely useless. Inside, the cabin was a time capsule. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light, slicing through the grimy window pane. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner, a simple cot covered in a faded quilt sat in another. On a small, rickety desk, he found a collection of old journals, bound in worn leather. They were Ilara's. Beside them, wrapped in a coarse burlap cloth, was a small, crudely carved wooden box. He carefully unwrapped the box, his fingers brushing against the rough material. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried moss, was a strange artifact. A piece of bone, polished smooth and carved with what looked like a family tree. But instead of names, the branches ended in small, jagged lines like a scar. He picked it up, the bone cool and light in his hand, and a shiver ran down his spine. It felt wrong, a relic of something deeply disturbing. A sudden sharp rap on the front door startled him, making him drop the bone back into the box. He turned to see a man standing on the porch, a weathered, wiry figure with a face like sun-baked leather. He wore faded overalls and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. "You'd be the new fella," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "Ethan Vance," he replied, feeling a surge of unease. "And you are?" "Just Cal. My place is just over the ridge," the man said, gesturing with a calloused thumb. "We heard you were coming. Folks round here know when a new face shows up." The implication was clear. There were no secrets in Blackwood Hollow. "Welcome to the Hollow," Cal said, but there was no warmth in his voice. "Just a word of advice. Some things are best left alone. You're not from here. You don't understand our ways." "What ways are those?" Ethan asked, his academic curiosity fighting with a growing sense of dread. Cal's shadowed eyes met his, and for a moment, Ethan felt the full weight of the man's warning. "Just old ways. The Kindred, they call them. Their tradition. It's what keeps this place pure, keeps it strong." "Kindred," Ethan repeated, his mind racing back to the kind of folklore he'd studied. "Is that a family name?" "It's a belief," Cal said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A pact. 100-year pact. You'll hear stories, but they're just that. Stories. You'd be wise to remember that." With a final, lingering stare that felt more like a threat than a welcome, Cal turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the woods. Ethan was left alone again, the silence of the hollow now feeling heavy with a terrible, unspoken history. He looked back at the desk, at the journals and the bone artifact. He had come here seeking a link to his past, a quiet place to write. But he had a feeling he had just stumbled into a story far more dangerous than any he had ever read. A story that was still being written. And he was now a character in it, whether he liked it or not. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of mystery and suspense. This is a work of fiction, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. The knock on the door was long gone, but its echo lingered, a phantom reminder of Cal's unsettling presence. Ethan stood in the middle of the small cabin, the air thick with the scent of old wood and musty paper. He looked at the journals on the desk, a morbid curiosity overriding his apprehension. He needed answers. What was this Kindred? What did Cal mean by old ways and 100-year pact? He felt the cold dread seeping into his bones, but his historian's mind took over, treating the situation like an academic puzzle, a grim field study. He picked up the first journal. The leather cover was soft with age, its pages brittle. The handwriting inside was a neat, flowing cursive, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world outside. It was Elara's hand. The entries were dated from decades ago, detailing her life in the Hollow. She wrote about her garden, the changing seasons, the simple rhythm of life in Blackwood Hollow. But interspersed with these mundane details were cryptic references to the tradition and the cleansing. November 12th, 1968, one entry read, "The moon is new tonight. The family has gathered. They say the blood must be pure. I don't understand. This isn't right, but the elders say it must be done for the survival of the Kindred. Young Thomas has been weak. His mind is clouded. They say he must be cleansed of the taint." A sick feeling churned in Ethan's stomach. Taint? What could she mean? He flipped through more pages. The language was coded, full of metaphors and veiled allusions. Elara seemed both a participant in and a victim of this strange practice. She wrote about the burden of their history and the sacrifices required to maintain their purity. The tone was one of profound resignation, a quiet despair that chilled Ethan to the bone. He then found a later entry, dated 10 years after the first one. January 5th, 1978. They came for Sarah. She wasn't weak. She was just different. She wanted to leave the Hollow, to see the world. That was her sin. They said her desire to leave was a poison in her soul, a taint that would spread and weaken the Kindred from within. I couldn't stop them. No one can stop the tradition. The Kindred always comes first. The last entry was the most disturbing. It was dated just a few months before her death. July 22nd, 2024. They know I have a son's grandson, a boy from the outside. They know he is my last living relative, the one who will inherit. The elders are talking. They say the blood is too thin, too far removed. A new branch must be grafted. A new cleansing is coming. I've left the journals. Let him know. Let him be warned. He must not stay. He must not become one of us. Ilara's words were a warning, a desperate plea from beyond the grave. Ethan looked at the small, crudely carved wooden box again. He picked up the bone artifact. It was a macabre family tree, and the jagged lines at the end of each branch suddenly took on a new, horrifying meaning. They weren't scars, they were breaks. 100-year tradition of severing the tainted from the family line. Cleansing by killing. The reality of the situation hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't some folktale. It was a living, breathing tradition, a dark and secret practice passed down through generations. The Kindred weren't a mythical family, but a real one, a secretive and insular group with a lethal belief system. And Ethan, the last of his line, was now in the crosshairs. He went to the front window and looked out into the deepening twilight. The cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The trees seemed to close in, their shadows long and menacing. He saw a flicker of movement by the tree line, a fleeting shadow that disappeared before he could be sure. Was it Cal? Or was it someone else? The Kindred? A car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the front of the cabin. A moment later, a sleek black pickup truck pulled into the clearing. It was far too new and well-maintained to belong to the locals. A woman stepped out, her face illuminated by the headlights. She was tall and slender, with striking green eyes and a cascade of fiery red hair. She wore a tailored jacket and jeans, a stark contrast to the rustic setting. She walked with a purpose, a confident stride that seemed out of place in Blackwood Hollow. "You must be Ethan Vance," she said, her voice sharp and clear, devoid of the local drawl. "I'm Sarah Vance, your second cousin once removed. We're related, on your great-aunt Ilara's side." Ethan felt a jolt of surprise. Another relative? But the journals. Ilara had a cousin named Sarah who wanted to leave. Was this the same Sarah? The one who was cleansed? He looked at her, searching for some sign of the past. Her face was calm and controlled, but her eyes held a spark of something he couldn't quite place, a mixture of fear and determination. "I knew you were coming," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I've been looking for you. The Kindred, they've been watching me too. I managed to get away years ago, but I know what they are capable of. My mother she was one of them. She told me about the tradition. I ran as soon as I could. But Ilara's journal said her cousin Sarah was cleansed for wanting to leave," Ethan said, his voice a low whisper. "She said they came for you." A cloud passed over Sarah's face. "They did," she said, her voice a ghost. "They thought they did. But I escaped. It's a long story. I've been living under a different name, always looking over my shoulder. When I heard you were coming, I had to warn you. You need to leave, now, before they get to you." "I can't just leave," Ethan said, his mind reeling. He had to know more. He had to understand. "I just found out about this. My great-aunt left me her journals. She wanted me to know." "She wanted you to leave." Sarah's voice was sharp with urgency. "They see you as a threat, an outsider who knows too much, or worse, a taint to be purged. My family, they're not like us, Ethan. They believe in the old ways. They will kill you to preserve their secret. It's not just a legend, it's a bloodline of killers." Her words were a chilling confirmation of his worst fears. He looked at her, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. He wasn't alone. He had an ally. But her urgency was a palpable thing, a tangible fear that filled the small cabin and made the shadows seem to writhe. "We need to get out of here," she said, her eyes scanning the dark tree line. "They're watching. They always are." Suddenly the lights flickered and died. The cabin was plunged into absolute darkness. The air outside grew still, a heavy, suffocating silence. A sense of being trapped, surrounded, settled over them. A quiet, terrifying menace had finally arrived at the doorstep. The darkness was a living thing, a suffocating presence that pressed in on all sides. Ethan fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal, no light. Sarah swore under her breath, her voice a low, tense whisper in the inky blackness. They cut the power. We're on their turf now. Who? Ethan asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Kindred, she said, her voice tight with fear. They've been planning this. They won't just let us leave. He could hear the creak of the floorboards as she moved towards the front window, a barely there silhouette against the faint glow of the moon. We need to get to my truck. If we can get out of the hollow before dawn, we have a chance. They moved silently, a shared understanding passing between them. The cabin felt like a tomb. They stepped out onto the porch, the night air a cold slap to the face. The moon was a sliver of light, and in its faint illumination, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold. Figures, a dozen of them standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless, their faces obscured by the shadows. They weren't holding flashlights. They were just watching. Silent sentinels of a sinister tradition. They're here, Ethan whispered, the words catching in his throat. They won't attack us directly, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Not yet. They have to follow their protocol. It's a psychological game. They want us to feel helpless, to feel the weight of their numbers. The cleansing is a ritual for them. It has to be perfect. He felt a deep sense of revulsion. This wasn't some gang or a cult. This was a family, a group of people who believed in this horrifying tradition with a chilling, fanatic conviction. They were playing a game, and Ethan and Sarah were the pawns. We have to get to my truck, Sarah repeated, her voice more urgent now. It's our only way out. They crept off the porch and moved towards the sleek black pickup, their footsteps silent on the damp earth. The figures at the tree line remained motionless. They were not a physical threat yet, but a psychological one, a constant looming presence that drained their courage and made every shadow seem to hold a killer. As they reached the truck, a sudden piercing wail echoed through the trees. It was a high, mournful sound, like a woman weeping in agony. It was followed by another and another, until the whole hollow seemed to be filled with the sound of phantom cries. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "The wail of the weeping mother," Sarah explained, her face pale in the faint moonlight. "It's another part of the ritual. It's meant to sow doubt, to make us feel guilty for leaving the family. It's all a mind game, Ethan. Don't listen to it." He tried to ignore the chilling cries, but they wormed their way into his mind, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. They were designed to evoke a profound sense of loss and guilt, a psychological manipulation that was as terrifying as any physical threat. As they fumbled with the truck door, a figure detached itself from the tree line and moved into the clearing. It was an old man, stooped with age, his face a web of wrinkles. He was the one Ilara's journal had mentioned, the elder of the Kindred. He held a gnarled walking stick, and as he walked towards them, he beat it rhythmically against the ground. Thump, thump, thump. "You've come to join us, young Ethan Vance," the old man said, his voice a dry rasp, devoid of emotion. "You've come home. The blood called you here. We will welcome you back into the fold." "We're leaving," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Let us go." The old man's eyes, dark and ancient, settled on her. "You are the one who ran," he said, a note of disappointment in his voice. "The tainted one, the one who refused the family. We've been watching you, Sarah. We knew you would return. The blood always returns." "This isn't my home," Ethan said, finding his voice. "I'm not part of your family. I don't believe in your traditions." "It is not about belief," the old man said, his face impassive. "It is about lineage, purity. Your line has grown thin, young Vance, tainted by the world outside. The cleansing must be done to ensure the blood is strong again. One of you is to be purified, to be reabsorbed into the land. The other will remain, to continue the line." The words were a hammer blow. One of them would die, one of them would live. They were being given a choice, a horrifying ultimatum that would force a desperate and deadly choice. A single, lethal coin flip. "What are you talking about?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "The family chooses," the old man said, his gaze shifting back to Ethan. "The chosen one will be cleansed. The other will take their place. You will both be tested. The one who proves themselves pure, who proves they understand the tradition, will live. The one who shows weakness, who shows the taint of the outside world, will be purified. The kindred will be watching. The game has begun." He then turned and walked back to the tree line, disappearing into the shadows, with the same silent grace with which he appeared. The figures remained, a silent, menacing audience. Ethan looked at Sarah. Her face was a mask of shock and terror. He had thought this was a simple escape, a race against time. But it was far more sinister. It was a test, a horrifying game with a lethal prize. They would be forced to turn on each other to prove their worth to a family of killers. The kindred was not just hunting them, they were pitting them against each other. "We have to leave." "Now," Sarah said, her voice a low whisper. "We can't let them get in our heads. We have to work together, Ethan." "But what happens if we fail their test?" he asked, the grim reality of the old man's words sinking in. Sarah's eyes, wide with fear, met his in the faint moonlight. "Then the kindred takes its sacrifice, and the bloodline of the Vances is cleansed." They got into the truck. Sarah fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. Ethan looked at the dark tree line, the figures standing like specters, and a single thought crystallized in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for his humanity. He would not let this monstrous family turn him into something he wasn't. He would not sacrifice Sarah, no matter the price. The game had begun, but he was not going to play by their rules. The engine roared to life, a sudden defiant sound in the quiet hollow. Sarah floored the gas, and the truck shot forward, tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase on the dirt road. The headlights cut a swathe through the darkness, illuminating the figures at the tree line, their faces still and emotionless. They did not move, did not give chase. They simply watched as the truck sped away, a silent promise in their stillness. "They're not following us," Ethan said, a flicker of bewildered relief in his voice. "They don't need to," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "They know this place better than we do. They know every path, every turn. This isn't a chase, it's a hunt, and we're the prey." The road was a treacherous, twisting ribbon of dirt and gravel clinging to the side of the mountain. Sarah drove with a practiced hand, her movements precise and confident, a stark contrast to the terrified woman from just moments before. It was a skill she had learned from growing up in the hollow, a knowledge of the land that went beyond any map. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his gaze darting to the rearview mirror. The clearing was long gone, swallowed by the darkness. "To the old mill," she said, her voice a low, urgent hum. "It's a few miles from here. It's an old family stronghold, a place no one goes to anymore. We can hide there, at least for the night. They'll have a harder time finding us in the ruins." As they drove, the landscape changed. The dense woods gave way to a more open, desolate terrain. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches like claws reaching for the sky. The air grew colder, and a thin, swirling mist began to creep in, obscuring the road ahead. It was a landscape straight out of a nightmare, a perfect setting for the Kindred's twisted game. "You mentioned you got away before," Ethan said, trying to push past his fear. What happened? How did you escape them? Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel. It was years ago. I was just a teenager. My father, he was the elder before the one we saw tonight. He knew I was different, that I didn't believe in the tradition. He told me I was tainted, that my mind was poisoned by the outside world. He said I would have to be cleansed eventually. So I ran. I just ran. They came after me. My mother said they tracked me for weeks. But I was fast. I knew the land. I found an old logging road, and I just kept going until I found a highway. I never looked back. I changed my name, my life, everything. And you came back for me? Ethan asked, a wave of gratitude and shame washing over him. He was a stranger to her, a man she had never met, and she had risked her life to warn him. I had to, she said, her voice full of a raw emotion. My mother. She never told me the whole story. She just said they were cleansers. I never knew the truth until years later when I started looking into the family history myself. I found old newspaper clippings, police reports that had been mysteriously closed. I pieced it all together. The cleansings were ritual murders. 100-year-old tradition passed down from generation to generation. They had a reason for everything. A twisted logic for every killing. And when I heard about Elara's death and your inheritance, I knew what they were planning. They see you as a new branch to be grafted or to be cut away. They're a family of killers, Ethan. They believe what they're doing is right. They're not insane. That's what makes them so terrifying. Her words were a chilling revelation. It wasn't about a lack of sanity. It was about a different kind of sanity, a belief system so twisted and entrenched that it justified the most horrific acts. They were rational killers, a cold and calculated menace that was far more frightening than any monster. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back of the truck. The truck swerved violently and Sarah fought for control. She managed to straighten it out, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. What was that? Ethan asked, his heart in his throat. A branch, she said, her voice tight. They've been setting traps. It's their way. A test. To see if we're pure enough to survive their land. Another thump echoed, and another and another. The truck was being pelted with rocks and branches. They were not just psychological tormentors. They were active hunters, using their knowledge of the land to their advantage. They were a family of killers, and this was their home. The old mill came into view. It was a skeletal ruin, a testament to a long-dead industry. The wooden framework was a black silhouette against the misty night, its broken windows like 100 empty eyes staring out at them. The creek that once powered the mill was now a murky, slow-moving stream. Sarah pulled the truck into the shadows behind the mill, and they got out. The air was cold and damp, filled with the smell of wet wood and decay. The place was silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the broken timbers. "This is it," she said, her voice a low whisper. "We can hide here. For now. No one comes here. They don't even like to. They say this place is cursed, too many accidents." They found a small hidden room beneath a collapsed section of the mill, a dark, damp space that felt both like a refuge and a trap. They were surrounded by the ghosts of a dead industry, a perfect reflection of their own predicament. "What's the plan?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "We wait until morning," she said, her eyes fixed on the dark, misty landscape outside. "And then we find a way to get a message out. We need to call the authorities, but we can't tell them everything. They'll never believe us." "They'll think we're crazy," Ethan said, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "A family of killers with a 100-year tradition? They'll just think it's a folktale." "Exactly," Sarah said, her voice grim. "We have to be smart. We have to give them something they can't ignore. Evidence. We have to prove to them that this is real." The hunt had begun, and they were in a desperate race against a family that had been playing this deadly game for over a century. A chilling thought struck Ethan. How many people had come to this hollow before him? How many had been cleansed? He looked at Sarah. She had survived. Maybe he could too. He felt the cold, hard weight of Ilara's journals in his backpack. They were the only proof he had, the only tangible link to the horror he had stumbled into. They were his lifeline, but they were also his burden. They were the reason the Kindred was after him. He was a historian, a man who sought to understand the past. But this past was not content to be understood. It was alive, and it wanted him dead. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of mystery and suspense. This is a work of fiction, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. The night was a long, cold ordeal, filled with the unsettling whispers of the wind and the imagined sounds of footsteps outside. Ethan and Sarah huddled in the damp darkness of the mill, their breath visible in the frigid air. Sleep was an impossible luxury, a terrifying descent into a world where the Kindred lurked in every shadow. They spoke in low whispers, their voices a thread of sanity in the encroaching madness. "The police won't believe us," Ethan repeated, the words a hollow echo of his own fears. "They'll think we're just two panicked city people making up stories." "Not if we have something tangible," Sarah said, her voice full of a desperate conviction. "Something they can't dismiss as folklore. My father, he had a ledger, a family record. It documented the cleansings and the reasons behind them. I was never allowed to see it, but I heard him talk about it. It would have 100 years of their history. It was a morbid trophy for them, proof of their lineage." "Where is it?" Ethan asked, a new sense of purpose overriding his fear. "In the old homestead, the Kindred's main house," she said, her face grim. "It's in the heart of the hollow, deep in their territory. It's a risk, Ethan, a huge one." "It's a better option than just waiting for them to find us," he said, his voice firm. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a researcher. He knew how to find things. He knew how to dig for the truth. This was his field now, and the stakes were higher than any he had ever faced. They waited until the first hint of dawn, a faint, milky light that bled through the broken timbers of the mill. The mist still clung to the ground, a thick, swirling blanket that obscured the landscape. It was a perfect cover. They left the mill and began their long, quiet trek through the woods. Sarah took the lead, her movements silent and graceful, a ghost in her own homeland. She navigated the treacherous terrain with an almost supernatural ease, avoiding fallen logs and hidden pitfalls. She was a woman who had spent her life in these woods, a part of the landscape she had fled from. "It's not just about getting the ledger," she said, her voice a low hum. "It's about what they'll do to us if they catch us. They won't just kill us, Ethan. They'll make it a cleansing. They'll use their psychological games to break us first. They'll pit us against each other. It's what they did to my mother. She helped them capture me, believing it was for my own good. It's how they stay strong. They turn family against family. It's their tradition." He felt a profound sense of horror at the thought. The Kindred didn't just kill their victims, they corrupted them first, turning them into participants in their own demise. They were masters of psychological manipulation, and they would use every tool at their disposal to force him to turn on Sarah. They moved closer to the center of the hollow. The air grew still, the sounds of the forest muted. The Kindred's homestead was a fortress of sorts, a cluster of cabins and outbuildings, surrounded by a makeshift fence of gnarled branches. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. They were home. They were waiting. Sarah pointed to an old, weathered barn. "We can get in through there," she whispered. "It's connected to a network of old tunnels and root cellars. They used to store food there. They won't be expecting us to come from below. They crept towards the barn, their movements slow and deliberate. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. A dog barked in the distance, a sharp, disembodied sound that made Ethan's heart leap into his throat. They found a small, almost invisible opening in the foundation of the barn, a space no larger than a fox's den. Sarah slipped through first, her body disappearing into the darkness. Ethan followed, squeezing through the tight opening, his clothes snagging on the rough-hewn stones. They were in a dark, claustrophobic tunnel, the air heavy with the smell of mold and rot. The tunnel led them to an old root cellar, and from there, a series of interconnected passages that led them towards the main house. It was a labyrinth, a dark underbelly of the hollow that few, if any, outsiders knew existed. They emerged into the main house through a hidden trapdoor in the pantry. The house was surprisingly well kept, clean and organized, a normal facade for a family with such a monstrous secret. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the rustic furniture. It was the home of a loving family, not a den of killers. The contrast was a cruel joke, a jarring disconnect that made Ethan's skin crawl. "My father's study is at the back of the house," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and old memories. "The ledger should be there. They keep it locked in a small chest behind the fireplace." They moved through the house, their footsteps silent on the old wooden floors. They were a pair of ghosts in their own family's house, hunted and alone. The study was a small, dusty room filled with old books and faded photographs. On the mantelpiece, above the cold fireplace, was a small, ornate wooden chest. It was locked. "They always kept a key hidden somewhere," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the room. "He used to say a true kindred would always find it." It was another test. They searched frantically, their eyes darting over every object, every crevice. A small, intricately carved wooden bird sat on the windowsill. Ethan picked it up. He turned it over in his hand. A small, almost invisible key was hidden in a hollowed-out section of its base. A test, a cruel psychological game. He had passed. He used the key to open the chest. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. He opened it, his fingers trembling. The pages were filled with names and dates, and beside each one, a short, chilling entry. Thomas Vance, weakness of mind, cleansed. Sarah Vance, taint of the outside world, purified. He looked at Sarah, a wave of profound relief and terror washing over him. It was here, the proof, the chilling, undeniable history of the kindred. But then he saw an entry from a few weeks prior. Ethan Vance, the last of the old blood, the final cleansing. A wave of dread washed over him. The kindred had an entry for him. A pre-written death sentence. This wasn't a test. It was a sentence. A slow, psychological execution. A lie. They had never intended to let either of them live. "They know we're here," a voice said, a deep, resonant rumble from the doorway. Ethan and Sarah spun around. Cal stood in the doorway, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. His face was a mask of cold fury. The game was over. They had walked right into the trap. Cal's eyes, cold and hard as flint, moved between Ethan and Sarah, his gaze lingering on the ledger in Ethan's hands. "You broke the rules," he said, his voice a low growl. "You were supposed to play the game, the test. But you cheated. You came to the heart of our home. You desecrated our history." "This isn't history," Ethan said, his voice shaking but firm. "It's a list of murders, a 100-year-old tradition of killing. This is proof, and we're going to give it to the police." Cal let out a short, harsh laugh. "The police? They'll never believe you. We're a tight-knit family, young Vance. Our word is our bond. And we'll tell them you're a couple of crazy outsiders who stumbled onto our property and tried to rob us. Who do you think they'll believe? The men and women who have lived here for generations? Or the two strangers with a stolen ledger?" Ethan knew he was right. The Kindred was a community, a family. They would protect their own, their secret, at all costs. The local law enforcement would be an extension of their power, a pawn in their game. "You are a taint, young Vance," Cal said, his gaze settling on Ethan. "Your mind is soft. You are weak. You are not worthy of the blood. Your sacrifice will cleanse the line. It will make us strong again." A new figure appeared in the doorway, a woman with a face like a hawk, her eyes as sharp and cold as an Arctic wind. She was dressed in simple, homespun clothes, and she held a knife in her hand, its blade glinting in the firelight. "The girl can stay," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "She is a Vance. Her blood is pure. She just needed to be brought back home. The taint will be cleansed, and the line will be strong again. You have to make a choice, Sarah." Ethan felt a jolt of alarm. "What choice?" he asked, his eyes darting between the two figures. The woman's lips twisted into a thin, humorless smile. "To prove her worth. To prove her purity. To show us that she is one of us. That she is truly a kindred." A terrible realization dawned on Ethan. The test. This was the final stage. The Kindred didn't just want to kill him. They wanted Sarah to do it. They wanted her to sacrifice him to prove her loyalty, to become one of them again. "No," Ethan said, his voice a desperate plea. "Don't listen to them, Sarah. They're trying to turn you against me. They're lying." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The woman from the doorway, the Kindred elder, stepped forward and put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It is the only way to prove you belong, to prove you are not a taint. You have to choose, Sarah. Him or us, him or the bloodline." Ethan could see the internal struggle in her eyes, the terror, the fear of the Kindred, and the desperate desire for acceptance, for a place to belong. He knew she had run from this life, but he also knew that the pull of family, however twisted, was a powerful thing. "You ran once," the woman said, her voice a low, hypnotic whisper, "and you lived with a lie that you were not one of us, a lie that you could escape your blood. But the blood called you back, didn't it? It called you back to the Hollow, and now you have to choose." Sarah's gaze shifted from the woman to Ethan. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a cold, unsettling emptiness. The Kindred had found her weak point, her desire for a home, for family, and they were using it against her. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said, her voice a ghost of a whisper. I can't run anymore." He felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't happening. She wouldn't betray him. They had been through so much. He had believed in her, but the look in her eyes was cold and distant, the look of someone who had given up, who had accepted her fate. "I am the last of the Vance bloodline," she said, her voice now firm and resolute. "I am Kindred. The blood must be pure." With a sudden, swift movement, she snatched the shotgun from Cal's hands. She didn't point it at Ethan. She pointed it at the woman in the doorway. "You're all a lie," she screamed, her voice a high, desperate wail. "The tradition is a lie. The purity is a lie. It's all just an excuse to kill." Ethan felt a surge of relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. It was a ruse, a psychological gambit. She had been playing their game, using their own twisted rules against them. Cal and the woman, the elder of the Kindred, stared at her, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. They had expected her to turn on Ethan. They had expected her to choose them. But she had turned on them instead. "You can't do this, Sarah," Cal said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You will be the taint. You will be the one who brings destruction upon us." "I am a Vance," she said, her voice ringing with a new, fierce determination. "And I am ending this. Now." Ethan looked at her, his heart filled with a profound and sudden respect. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, a warrior. She was fighting for her freedom, for her life, for her own humanity. He was not alone. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now, before they come back." They ran, leaving the Kindred elders behind them, their faces a mixture of fury and shock. They had underestimated Sarah. They had underestimated the strength of a person who had escaped their clutches once and would not fall back into their grasp again. They ran towards the woods, the stolen ledger clutched in Ethan's hand, its weight a promise of justice, of exposure, of an end to the 100-year killing tradition. But as they ran, they heard the sound of footsteps behind them. The Kindred were not going to let them go so easily. The game was far from over. It was just entering its final, most dangerous stage. The Kindred were no longer playing a psychological game. They were coming for them. The woods were a suffocating darkness, the trees a tight, twisting maze of branches that seemed to reach out and snag them. Ethan and Sarah ran, their lungs burning, the cold air a sharp pain in their chests. The sounds of pursuit were close behind them, the relentless crunch of boots on fallen leaves, the low, guttural calls of the Kindred, a terrifying chorus that echoed through the night. They were no longer silent sentinels. They were an enraged hunting pack. "They're not playing games anymore," Ethan gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. "They're just hunting us." "They've been humiliated," Sarah said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "They believed their rituals were unbreakable. They believed their control was absolute. We proved them wrong. They won't stop until they find us. They will kill us to keep their secret safe." They had the ledger, the undeniable proof of the Kindred's horrifying history. But the ledger was a paper trail. They were the living witnesses. The Kindred would not rest until every link to their secret was severed. "We have to get to a phone," Ethan said, his mind racing. "A landline, a place where there's no signal jammer. The old logging station. I saw it on the map. It's a few miles from here. It should have a phone line." "It's on the other side of the ridge," Sarah said, her voice full of doubt. "They'll be waiting for us. They know every inch of this land." "We have to take the chance," he said, his voice firm. "It's the only way. We have to expose them. We have to end this." They changed their direction, heading towards the ridge, their movements a frantic, desperate attempt to outrun a force that knew their land better than they knew their own homes. The Kindred's pursuit was relentless, a chilling echo in the darkness. Suddenly Sarah stopped, her hand shooting out to stop Ethan. He followed her gaze. A few yards ahead, in the faint light of the moon, he saw them. A silent, menacing line of Kindred stood blocking the path, their faces as impassive as stone. "They knew," Ethan whispered, the words catching in his throat. "They knew where we were going." Sarah grabbed his hand. "There's an old creek bed," she said, her voice urgent. "It's hidden by a thicket of thorns. We can slip through there. It'll be slow, but they won't expect it." They plunged into the thorny thicket, the branches tearing at their clothes and skin. The pain was a dull throb, a secondary concern to the cold dread that was a constant companion. They could hear the voices of the Kindred, the low, angry murmurs, as they realized their prey had slipped past them. They emerged on the other side, exhausted and bleeding, but they were still alive. The creek bed was a rough, rocky path, but it led them in the right direction. The logging station was now in sight, a collection of old abandoned shacks and a single skeletal radio tower that stood like a monument to a forgotten age. They crept towards the main office, a small, rickety building with a broken window. The door was unlocked. They slipped inside. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of dust and old wood. An old rotary phone sat on a desk, its cord still attached to the wall. Sarah lunged for the phone. She picked up the receiver. No dial tone. The line was dead. "They cut the line," she said, her voice filled with a profound sense of defeat. They knew. They knew what we were going to do." A sense of despair washed over them. They had risked everything, and it had all been for nothing. They were trapped. The Kindred had anticipated every move. They had outwitted them at every turn. "They're not just killers," Ethan said, a new chilling realization dawning on him. "They're master strategists. They've been doing this for 100 years. They know how to hunt. They know how to corner their prey." A loud, shattering noise from the main door made them jump. It was the sound of a rock hitting wood. The door began to splinter. The Kindred had found them. "The radio tower," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "There has to be a way to send a signal." They scrambled out the back door and ran towards the radio tower, a tall, rusted lattice of steel that rose into the misty sky. A ladder was bolted to its side. It was old and precarious, but it was their only option. "I'll go up," Ethan said, his heart pounding against his ribs. "I'll try to find a way to connect a signal." "Be careful," Sarah said, her face pale in the faint moonlight. "They're right behind us." He began to climb, his hands and feet finding purchase on the cold, rusted rungs. The height was dizzying, the wind a low moan in his ears. He could hear the Kindred below, their voices a low, angry hum. They were at the base of the tower, and they were beginning to climb. He reached the top, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He looked down at the Kindred, their faces a pale, malevolent smear in the darkness. He had to think. He had to be smart. He saw a series of loose wires, a frayed, tangled mess. He had no idea what they were for, but he had to try. He grabbed 2 of the wires and scraped them together, a shower of sparks flying in the cold air. Nothing. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from below. The ladder. The Kindred were cutting it down. He was trapped. There was no way down. He looked at the wires again. He had to get a signal. He had to get the word out. He had to expose them. He thought of Ilara, her desperate plea in the journal. He thought of Sarah, her courage, her betrayal, her ultimate redemption. He thought of all the victims in the ledger, the silent names of 100 years of murder. He had to do this. He grabbed the 2 frayed wires, his hands shaking, and held them together. He closed his eyes, a prayer on his lips. He was not a fighter. He was a historian. He had to use the only tool he had, knowledge. He felt a sudden, sharp jolt of electricity, a blinding flash of light that made his body convulse. He fell, the ledger slipping from his grasp, his body plummeting to the ground. The last thing he heard was Sarah's scream, a high, piercing wail that was lost in the vast, indifferent darkness of the Appalachian Mountains. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of mystery and suspense. This is a work of fiction, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Ethan's world was a blur of pain and darkness, punctuated by flashes of searing white light. He felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his leg, a dull throb in his head. He was lying on a hard, unforgiving surface, the cold air biting at his skin. He opened his eyes, and the world was a dizzying spiral of stars and shadows. He was on the ground, at the base of the radio tower, the broken ladder, a jagged silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. He heard a voice, a frantic, worried whisper. "Ethan, Ethan, are you okay? Speak to me." It was Sarah. He tried to speak, but only a low groan escaped his lips. He felt a gentle hand on his shoulder, a presence that was both a comfort and a reminder of their shared predicament. "I'm here," she said, her voice filled with a desperate relief. "I saw you fall. I thought you were dead." He looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her eyes wide with fear. The Kindred were gone. The silence was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket that had replaced the sounds of their pursuit. "They're gone," he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "They scattered," she said, her voice still shaky. "The electricity. You caused a power surge. It hit them. It wasn't enough to kill them, but it stunned them. It gave me time to get to you, and I found the ledger." She held up the leather-bound book, its cover scuffed and dirty, but otherwise intact. The evidence, their one and only hope. "We have to go," she said, her voice filled with a new urgency. "They'll be back. They'll be angrier. And they won't stop until they find us." He tried to stand, but a sharp pain shot through his leg, and he collapsed back to the ground. "I can't," he said, the words a bitter admission of defeat. "My leg, it's broken." A wave of despair washed over him. He was a liability, a burden. He couldn't run, he couldn't fight, he was trapped, and the Kindred were coming. Sarah looked at him, her face a mixture of fear and determination. She was the one who had escaped once. She was a survivor. She wasn't going to give up. "We can't go to the police," she said, her mind racing. "Not yet, not like this. They won't believe us. Not with no proof of a crime. We need to go to someone who knows the Hollow, someone who knows the Kindred, someone who will believe us." "Who?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "There's an old hermit," she said, her voice a low hum. "He lives in a cave on the other side of the mountain. They call him Silas. He was cast out of the Hollow years ago. He knows their secrets. He knows the tradition. He can help us. He can be our witness." The idea was a long shot, a desperate attempt to find a single ally in a world filled with enemies, but it was their only chance. Sarah helped him to his feet, her arms strong and steady. She half carried, half dragged him through the woods, her movements slow and deliberate, a physical testament to her determination. They moved in the direction of the hermit's cave, a new objective in their desperate race for survival. As they moved, Ethan felt a new sense of purpose, a new kind of strength. He was a historian. He had spent his life studying the past. He had stumbled into a past that was alive and wanted him dead. But he wasn't going to just be a victim. He was going to fight. He was going to use the only weapon he had, knowledge. The knowledge contained in the ledger, the knowledge of the Kindred's secrets. The sun began to rise, a crimson stain on the eastern horizon, painting the world in a wash of eerie light. They reached the cave, a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain. The entrance was shrouded in a curtain of vines and moss. Sarah helped him inside. The cave was small and damp, filled with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. A small fire crackled in the center of the cave, and an old man sat beside it, his face a web of deep lines, his eyes a sharp, intelligent blue. He was Silas, the hermit, the outcast. "I knew you were coming," Silas said, his voice a dry rasp, his gaze settling on them. The whispers in the hollow, the old ones were restless, a new cleansing. I knew it was only a matter of time. Sarah explained everything, her voice a rush of words, a desperate plea for help. She told him about the Kindred, the 100-year killing tradition, the ledger. She held it out to him, a symbol of their hope. Silas took the ledger, his old hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. His eyes, full of a deep, sorrowful understanding, scanned the names, the dates, the chilling entries. He was seeing his own history, his own past, laid out in black and white. "It is all here," he said, his voice a low, mournful whisper. "The truth, the secret we've all been hiding, the blood of the Vances. It is a curse, a stain." He looked at Ethan, a flicker of something that resembled pity in his eyes. "You've stumbled into a world you don't understand, young man. A world of old beliefs and twisted traditions. You have to expose them. You have to tell the world. For all the ones who were cleansed. For all the ones who were lost." A new plan formed in Ethan's mind. It wasn't enough to just give the police the ledger. They needed a witness. They needed Silas. A man who had lived with the Kindred secret for so long. A man who had been a part of their world. He was the key. He was the one who could make them believe. Suddenly, a loud crash from outside made them jump. The sound of rocks being dislodged, the heavy tread of boots, the Kindred. They had found them. They had anticipated their move. The hunt was not over. It was just beginning again. From the cave's entrance, Cal emerged, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have stolen the sacred ledger," he growled. "You have corrupted one of our own." His eyes, filled with profound hatred, settled on Silas. The old taint returns. Silas stood, his body frail but his gaze defiant. "This isn't a tradition, Cal. It's a curse. A disease that has poisoned our family for 100 years. "The world will never know," Cal said, stepping forward with a lethal purpose. "The Kindred will be cleansed of you, the girl, and the boy from the outside." "This ends now, Cal," Sarah said, stepping in front of Ethan. Just then, a loud, piercing sound echoed from the mouth of the cave. It was a police siren. Cal's face contorted with shock and fury. "They're here," Ethan whispered, a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The power surge. It was a distress signal. We knew it would be cryptic, but we hoped someone would hear. The police lights flashed, and 2 officers emerged from the darkness. As one officer moved to tackle Cal, the Kindred elder lunged for the ledger. He managed to tear it from Silas's grasp, but as he did, the officer brought him to the ground. The book flew from his hands, its pages scattering in the wind, 100 years of secrets exposed. The other officer, grabbing the book, looked at the pages, his eyes wide with a growing horror. He had seen the truth. Cal, now in handcuffs, stared at the officer, his face pale with a cold, terrifying dread. He had lost. The Kindred's secret was out. The other members scattered into the woods, but their reign of terror was over. The 100-year pact was broken. The sun rose over Blackwood Hollow, revealing a scene of quiet chaos. The Kindred had scattered, their menacing presence replaced by the cold, impartial reality of law enforcement. Ethan, his leg in a cast, sat on the back of an ambulance with Sarah. The lead detective approached them, his voice low and weary. "We've got a lot of work to do," he said. "The names in this book match old, unsolved missing person cases. This is unlike anything I've ever seen." "What about the ones who got away?" Ethan asked. The detective looked out at the misty mountains. "They'll go to ground. They know this land. We'll find some, but the rest will just disappear. They'll wait. And they'll come back." Sarah looked at the hollow, her eyes filled with a new, quiet strength. "The hollow will never be the same," she said. "The secret is out. But the fear, it will linger." "What are you going to do?" Ethan asked her. "I'm going to stay," she said, her voice firm. "This is my home, and I'm going to face it. I'm going to help the authorities and make sure the truth is told. I'll be the one who finally ends this." A wave of respect washed over Ethan. "And me? The historian?" he asked. He looked at the small, remote cabin that was now his inheritance. He had a duty, a new purpose. "I'm going to write a book," he said, his voice filled with a new determination. "I'm going to tell the world. I'm going to be their voice, the voice of all the ones who were cleansed. I'm going to make sure the Kindred is never just a folk tale again." The Kindred was not a fantasy. It was a horrifying reality, a story of a family and a 100-year tradition of madness. And now, the light was shining on it. The secret was out, the hunt was over, the reckoning had begun. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of mystery and suspense. This is a work of fiction, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.